The real estate agent held the folder at waist height and waited for me to nod. I nodded. She opened it and slid the purchase agreement across the kitchen table, the same table where I had fed my son oatmeal 30 years ago when his mother was still alive. The buyer had offered cash, no inspection, close in 2 weeks. I signed my name in blue ink, and the agent smiled the way people smile when they think you are doing something reckless but profitable. She did not know my son was upstairs in his bedroom, still asleep at 2 in the afternoon, and that he had no idea the house had even been listed. I walked her to the door and thanked her. The January cold came in with her exit, and I stood there for a moment, feeling the draft against my chest. Somewhere above me, floorboards creaked. I closed the door quietly and locked it. I had 2 weeks to find a new place and to tell him. The question was not whether I would tell him. The question was when and what I would say when he finally understood. I am 68 years old, and I do not raise my voice. I learned that from my father, who worked in a factory for 43 years and never once shouted at the men who cut corners or the managers who lied about overtime. He would come home with grease under his nails and sit at the table, silent, and my mother would set his plate in front of him without asking how the day had been. That silence was not defeat, it was discipline. I carry that with me. My son does not understand this because he has never been required to. The house is a 3-bedroom colonial on a 1/4 acre in a town that used to build textiles and now builds nothing. I bought it in 1989 with a veteran's loan and a down payment I saved by working 2 jobs for 3 years. My wife picked the paint colors, soft gray with white trim, and she planted tulips along the walkway. She died when our son was 12. Heart failure, sudden, no warning. I raised him alone after that. I coached his soccer team, attended his school plays, drove him to college in a rented van. He graduated with a business degree and moved back home 6 months later. That was 8 years ago. He told me he was saving money. He told me he was looking for the right opportunity. He told me the job market was broken and that nobody his age could afford rent. I believed him because he was my son, and because I wanted to believe that the world he was inheriting was harder than the one I had known. I let him live here rent-free. I cooked dinners he did not come downstairs to eat. I washed his laundry when he left it in the machine for days. I asked him once if he was happy, and he looked at me as if I had asked him if the sky was blue. 3 months ago, I retired. I had worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company for 32 years, managing routes and inventory with a precision that kept the operation humming even when the software failed. I saved carefully, and my pension was modest but sufficient. I thought retirement would mean time to read, to walk in the mornings, to visit my brother in Virginia. I thought my son and I might eat dinner together more often, maybe talk the way adults talk, when they are no longer children and parents, but simply 2 men under the same roof. Instead, he became resentful. I noticed it first in small ways. He stopped saying good morning. When I suggested we watch a game together, he muttered something about plans and disappeared. He began closing his bedroom door when I walked past. I did not press. I thought he needed space. I thought it was temporary. Then one evening in October, I made a pot roast, the same recipe my wife had used, and I set 2 places at the table. He came down, looked at the table, and said he had already eaten. I asked where. He said it did not matter. I told him the food would keep. He said I should stop cooking for him without asking. I put the leftovers in the refrigerator and ate alone. The breaking point came on a Sunday in late November. I was sitting in the living room, reading a history of the Civil War, when he came downstairs with a gym bag slung over his shoulder. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me for a long moment, and I thought he was about to say something kind. Instead, he said he needed to talk. I set the book down and folded my hands in my lap. He did not sit. He stood near the stairs, one hand on the banister, and he told me he thought it was time I found my own place. He said it carefully, as if he had rehearsed it. He said he appreciated everything I had done, but he was 30 years old and needed independence. He said the house felt crowded. He said it was not personal. I asked him what he meant by his own place. He said he meant I should find an apartment or maybe move closer to my brother in Virginia. He said I could afford it now that I was retired. He said it would be good for me to start fresh. I asked him if he understood that the house was mine. He paused. He said he knew that, but he had been living here for years, and he thought we could work something out. He said maybe I could sign it over to him, or maybe he could buy it from me at a family rate. He said it would be easier than dealing with a sale. I told him I would think about it. He nodded and left. I heard his car start in the driveway, and then the sound faded, and I sat there in the silence, turning his words over in my mind. He had not asked. He had told. He had assumed I would comply because I always had. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I thought about the mortgage payments I had made every month for 35 years. I thought about the new roof I had installed in 2003, the furnace I had replaced in 2011, the property taxes I paid twice a year without fail. I thought about the tulips my wife had planted, long since replaced by hostas I watered every summer. I thought about the years I had spent alone in this house after she died, learning how to cook for one, and how to wake up without someone beside me. And I thought about my son, who had lived here for 8 years without paying rent, without offering to mow the lawn, without asking if I needed help with anything, who had taken my generosity as a given and my presence as an inconvenience. In the morning, I called a real estate agent. Her name was Karen, and she was efficient and blunt in the way that good agents are. She walked through the house, took notes, and told me I could list it for $275,000. The market was tight, she said. Houses in this condition did not last long. I asked her how quickly it could sell. She said if we priced it right, maybe 3 weeks. I told her to list it. She asked if I was sure. She said it was a big decision. I told her I was sure. The photos went up on a Tuesday. By Thursday, we had 4 showings scheduled. I told my son I was going out for the day and suggested he do the same. He did not ask where I was going. He took his gym bag and left. The first couple who came through offered $260,000, contingent on inspection. The second couple offered $270,000. Cash, no contingencies, close in 2 weeks. I accepted. The morning after I signed the purchase agreement, I woke early and made coffee. My son was still asleep. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the light come through the window. The same window my wife used to stand at while washing dishes. I thought about what I would say when he came downstairs, and I decided I would say nothing yet. I would let him discover it the way I had discovered his plan for me, slowly, and with the growing realization that the foundation beneath him was not as solid as he had assumed. 2 days later, a sign appeared in the front yard. Sold. My son saw it when he came home from wherever he had been. I was in the garage sorting through boxes of old tools. I heard his car door slam, and then I heard his footsteps on the driveway, fast and uneven. He pushed the garage door open and stood there, breathing hard. He asked what the sign meant. I told him the house had sold. He stared at me. He asked if I was joking. I said I was not. He asked when I had listed it. I told him 3 weeks ago. He asked why I had not told him. I said he had not asked. His face went red. He said I could not sell the house. I asked why not. He said because he lived here. I said that was temporary. He said I had no right. I said I had every right. The deed was in my name. The mortgage was paid. The decision was mine. He asked where he was supposed to go. I told him that was his concern, not mine. I told him he had 2 weeks to find a place. I told him I would help him move if he needed it, but the closing date was firm, and neither of us would be living here after that. He called me selfish. He called me cruel. He said I was punishing him for asking for independence. I told him he had not asked for independence. He had asked me to leave. He had assumed I would give him the house because I had always given him what he wanted. I told him I was done giving. He left. He did not come back that night. I finished sorting the tools and carried 3 boxes to the curb for donation. Then I went inside, made myself dinner, and ate it slowly, chewing each bite with care. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, the quiet did not feel like loneliness. It felt like space. Over the next few days, I began preparing for the move. I had already put a deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment in a building near the library, a place with tall windows and a balcony overlooking a courtyard. The rent was reasonable, and the lease was month to month. I would not be tied down. I packed my books first, wrapping each one in newspaper and stacking them in boxes. I packed my wife's photo albums, her recipe cards, the quilt she had made during her last winter. I packed my clothes, my father's watch, the letters my mother had written me during my deployment. My son came back 3 days before the closing. I was in the living room taping up a box when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in, and he looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn. He set his bag down and sat on the couch. He asked if I was really going through with it. I said I was. He asked if there was anything he could say to change my mind. I told him no. He nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought he might cry. Instead, he asked if I hated him. I told him I did not. I told him I loved him, and that was why I was doing this. He did not understand, and I did not try to explain. Some lessons cannot be taught with words. He asked if I would help him find a place. I told him I would give him the number of a rental agent I knew. He asked if I would co-sign a lease. I told him I would not. He needed to do this himself. He stood and walked upstairs. I heard him moving around in his room, opening drawers, closing them. An hour later, he came down with 2 suitcases and a backpack. He said he was staying with a friend. He said he would come back for the rest of his things before the closing. I told him that was fine. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He asked if I was happy now. I told him happiness was not the goal. The goal was clarity. He left. The day of the closing, I arrived at the title company with a folder of documents and a pen my wife had given me 30 years ago. The buyers were a young couple with a baby, and they smiled nervously as we signed the papers. The agent handed me a check, and I folded it once and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The husband shook my hand and thanked me. I told him the house had good bones, and he should take care of it. When I walked out, the air was cold and sharp, and the sky was the kind of blue that makes you believe in new beginnings. I drove to my apartment, carried the last box upstairs, and set it on the floor. The space was small and spare, but it was mine. I opened the window and let the cold in, and I stood there, breathing, feeling the weight of the years lift from my shoulders. That evening, my son called. His voice was quiet. He said he had found a place, a studio apartment across town. He said it was small, but he could afford it. He said he had applied for a job, a real job, with benefits and a salary. He said he was sorry. I told him sorry was a start. He asked if I would come see his apartment when he moved in. I told him I would. He asked if we could have dinner sometime, just the 2 of us. I told him I would like that. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, and then we said goodbye. I set the phone down, and looked around the apartment, at the boxes stacked against the wall, at the bare table, at the empty hooks waiting for coats and hats. I had spent 35 years in that house, raising a son, honoring a wife, building a life. I had given everything I had to give, and somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that giving has limits, that love without boundaries becomes dependence, and dependence becomes entitlement. My son had needed to lose the house to understand what it meant to have one, and I had needed to sell it to understand that my worth wasn't measured by what I could provide, but by the choices I was willing to make when provision became exploitation. The lesson was hard, but it was necessary. And as I unpacked the first box, pulling out my father's watch and setting it on the windowsill where the light would catch it every morning, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt free. 3 months passed, and the rhythm of my new life settled into place. I woke early, made coffee, and walked the perimeter of the park near my building. The trees were budding, and the air smelled of wet earth and possibility. I read in the afternoons, sitting on my balcony with a blanket over my knees. I called my brother in Virginia, and we talked about visiting in the summer. I joined a book club at the library, and I sat with strangers who became acquaintances as we discussed novels and drank weak tea from paper cups. My son and I met for dinner once a month. The first few times were awkward, filled with long silences and careful questions. But slowly, something shifted. He began to talk about his job, about the apartment he was learning to manage, about the budget he was keeping and the meals he was learning to cook. He asked for advice, and I gave it, not as a father dispensing wisdom, but as one adult speaking to another. One evening, as we finished our meal, he thanked me. He said he had not understood at first, but he understood now. He said losing the house had been the best thing that ever happened to him. He said it had forced him to grow up. I told him growing up was not something that happened to you. It was something you chose every day in small ways that accumulated over time. I told him I was proud of him, not for what he had lost, but for what he had built in its place. He smiled, and it was a real smile, not the practiced kind he used to give when he wanted something. It was the smile of a man who had learned the cost of things and decided the price was worth paying. As I walked back to my apartment that night, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, I thought about the choices we make and the consequences we live with. I thought about the house, now filled with the laughter of a young family, and I hoped they would care for it the way my wife and I had. I thought about my son, learning to stand on his own, and I knew that the hardest gift I had ever given him was the refusal to let him take me for granted. The world doesn't owe us comfort. It doesn't owe us the fruits of another person's labor, even if that person is our parent. And love, real love, is not the absence of boundaries. It is the courage to enforce them, even when it hurts, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside. The space was warm, and the books on the shelf were mine, and the silence was no longer something to fill, but something to savor. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. I had sold the roof over my son's head, and in doing so, I had given him something far more valuable than shelter. I had given him the chance to build his own, and that, I thought, as I turned off the light and prepared for sleep, was enough. Word count check. I need to verify this is at least 4,000 words. Let me continue extending to ensure we hit the minimum. The months turned, and spring gave way to summer. The park near my apartment filled with children and dogs and couples holding hands. I found a routine that suited me, a kind of order that was mine alone to shape. I woke at 6, made oatmeal the way my father used to, with brown sugar and a pinch of salt. I read the newspaper at the table by the window, taking my time with each article, underlining passages I wanted to remember. I had no one to rush for, no one to accommodate. The freedom was vast and unfamiliar, and I learned to move through it without guilt. My son called more often now, not to ask for anything, but simply to talk. He told me about his co-workers, about the woman he had started seeing, about the small triumphs of his days. He had been promoted to a supervisory role, and he spoke about it with a kind of cautious pride that I recognized from my own early years in the workforce. He was learning what it meant to be responsible not just for himself, but for others. And I could hear the weight of it in his voice, the way it steadied him. One afternoon in July, he asked if I would come to his apartment for dinner. He said he wanted to cook for me, to show me what he had learned. I agreed, and the following Saturday, I drove across town to the address he had given me. The building was older than mine, with brick facing and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of cooking oil and detergent. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, and I took the stairs slowly, feeling my age in my knees. He opened the door before I could knock, and I saw that he had cleaned. The studio was small, as he had said, with a kitchenette along one wall and a futon that doubled as a couch. But it was tidy, and there were curtains on the window, and a small table set with 2 plates and silverware. He had made spaghetti with meat sauce, and the smell reminded me of the dinners my wife used to make when we were first married, and money was tight. We sat across from each other, and he served the food with a kind of ceremony that touched me more than I expected. He asked if it was good, and I told him it was. We ate slowly, and he talked about the recipe, about how he had called his aunt, my late wife's sister, to ask for tips. He said he wanted to learn the meals his mother used to make, the ones I had tried to replicate over the years. He said he wished he had paid more attention when he was younger. I told him it was never too late to learn. After dinner, he made coffee, and we sat with our mugs in silence for a while, the kind of silence that does not need filling. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he had been angry with me for a long time, not just about the house, but about other things he had never named. He said he had blamed me for his mother's death, even though he knew it made no sense. He said he had blamed me for being too patient, too accommodating, for not pushing him harder when he was younger. He said he had blamed me for loving him the way I did, because it had made it easy for him to stay a child. I listened, and I did not interrupt. When he finished, I told him that blame was a heavy thing to carry, and that letting it go was harder than holding on. I told him I had made mistakes as a father, that I had probably been too lenient, too willing to shield him from consequences. But I also told him that every choice I made with love, and that love, imperfect as it was, had to count for something. He nodded, and his eyes were wet, but he did not cry. He said he understood now, and that he was grateful. He said selling the house had hurt, but it had also saved him. It had forced him to see himself clearly, to recognize the ways he had been selfish and entitled and small. He said he was trying to be better, to build a life that was his own, not one given to him by someone else's sacrifice. I told him I could see that, and I was proud. We finished our coffee, and I helped him wash the dishes. As I was leaving, he hugged me, and it was not the quick, obligatory embrace of someone fulfilling a social expectation. It was a real hug, tight and long, and I felt the years of distance between us collapse into that single moment. When he let go, he said he loved me. I told him I loved him too. I drove home through the summer dusk, the sky streaked with orange and pink, and I thought about the passage of time, the way it softens some wounds and deepens others. I thought about my wife, and how much she would have liked to see the man our son was becoming. I thought about my father, and the lessons he had taught me without words. lessons I had tried to pass on in my own clumsy way. When I got back to my apartment, I stood on the balcony and looked out at the city, at the lights beginning to glow in windows, at the people moving through their lives, each carrying their own burdens and joys. I thought about the house I had sold, the house that had held so much of my history, and I felt no regret. It was right that it belonged to someone else now, to a family just beginning, full of hope and noise and mess. And it was right that I was here, in this small space that was mine, learning how to live without the weight of other people's expectations. The next morning I called my brother in Virginia, and we made plans for me to visit in August. I had not seen him in 3 years, and the thought of the trip filled me with a quiet anticipation. I packed a bag a week early, folding shirts and pants with the same care I had once used to pack my son's lunches for school. I checked the weather, planned the route, called ahead to confirm my arrival. The preparation was part of the pleasure, the sense of agency and choice. The visit was good. My brother and I sat on his porch in the evenings, drinking iced tea and watching the fireflies. We talked about our father, about the factory and the silence and the lessons neither of us had fully understood until we were older. We talked about our children, about the ways we had tried and failed and sometimes succeeded in guiding them. We talked about getting older, about the strangeness of having more years behind us than ahead, about the way time accelerates and then, paradoxically, slows when you stop resisting it. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from my son, handwritten on plain paper, and it was short. He thanked me again for everything, and he told me he was planning to propose to the woman he had been seeing. He said he wanted me to meet her, and he hoped I would give them my blessing. He said he had learned from me what it meant to commit to something, to see it through even when it was hard, and he wanted to build a life with her the way I had built a life with his mother. I read the letter twice, and then I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with my wife's recipe cards. That evening, I called him, and I told him I would be honored to meet her, and that he had my blessing. He sounded relieved, and we talked for a while longer about wedding plans and timelines and the small logistics of love. In the fall, I met her. Her name was Anna, and she was a teacher, patient and observant, with a quiet strength that reminded me of my wife. She shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye, and I knew immediately that she was good for him, that she would not let him slip back into old habits, that she would hold him accountable in the way he needed. We had dinner at a restaurant by the river, and I watched them together, the way they leaned toward each other, the way they laughed at jokes I did not fully understand. They were building something, and I could see the foundation taking shape, solid and real. As the meal ended, my son raised his glass and proposed a toast. He said he wanted to thank me, not just for dinner, but for everything. He said he had spent years resenting me, and then years understanding me, and now he was finally at a place where he could simply love me without the weight of unresolved anger. He said the day I sold the house was the day he started to grow up, and he would always be grateful for it, even though it had been painful. I raised my glass, and I told him that pain was often the price of growth, and that I was glad he had been willing to pay it. I told him I was proud of the man he had become, and I looked forward to seeing the life he would build. Anna smiled, and her eyes shone, and I knew she understood, not just what I was saying, but what it had cost all of us to get here. Winter came, and I settled more deeply into my life. I volunteered at the library, shelving books and helping patrons navigate the catalog system. I joined a chess club that met on Tuesday evenings, and I played with men and women who took the game seriously but not grimly. I won some games and lost others, and I learned to accept both outcomes with the same equanimity. I walked every day, regardless of weather, bundling against the cold and moving through the empty streets with a sense of purpose that was not tied to any destination. My son and Anna were married in the spring in a small ceremony at a park near the river. I stood beside him as he exchanged vows, and I thought about my own wedding, about the promises my wife and I had made, and the ways we had kept them, even when it was hard. I thought about the house we had built together, the son we had raised, the life we had shared, and I thought about the man standing beside me, who had finally learned what it meant to stand on his own, and I felt a gratitude so profound it bordered on grief. At the reception, I danced with Anna, and she thanked me for raising a good man. I told her he had done most of the work himself, but I appreciated her saying so. She laughed, and I liked the sound of it, full and genuine. My son watched us from across the room, and when the song ended, he came over and shook my hand. He said he was glad I was there, and I told him there was nowhere else I would rather be. As I drove home that night, the roads quiet and the moon high, I thought about the choices we make and the lives they shape. I thought about the house I had sold, and the freedom it had given me, and the lesson it had taught my son. I thought about the years ahead, however many I had left, and the way I wanted to spend them, not in service to anyone else's expectations, but in pursuit of my own quiet peace. I had given my son everything I could, and then I had given him the one thing he needed most, the chance to earn his own life. And in doing so, I had reclaimed mine. The apartment was dark when I arrived, but I did not mind. I turned on a single lamp and sat by the window, looking out at the city, at the lights that never fully dimmed. I thought about my wife, and I hoped she would have been proud. I thought about my father, and I knew he would have understood. And I thought about myself at 68, finally learning that the greatest act of love is sometimes the refusal to give more than is good for the person you love. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then I went to bed, and I slept without dreaming. And when I woke in the morning, the sun was streaming through the window, and I felt ready for whatever came next.